Welcome, everyone, to the New York Times and College discussion, Lessons from the Corner Office. We're looking forward to you joining the conversation. For those of you joining us virtually, please type your questions into the comment box, and I will give those to our speaker. We're thrilled to have Adam Bryant with us today. Adam is the Corner Office columnist at the New York Times and has been a journalist for more than 2 decades. In March 2009, Adam started Corner Office in the Times Sunday Business section, and it quickly attracted a large and loyal following with the business world, but also among students, professors, even soldiers, who turn to Corner Office each week for insights and takeaways they can apply to their own lives. Adam interviews CEOs and asks not about their strategy for their companies, but because CEOs are their true 24/7 roles are as leaders and managers, building teams, creating a sense of mission, and fostering a high-performance culture, Adam asks, how do they do that, and how did they learn to do that? From his interviews, Adam wrote the Corner Office book, which reveals the keys to success, including the 5 essential traits, personality traits, that all high performers exhibit. Qualities that the CEOs themselves value most and that separate the rising stars from their colleagues. Adam's next book on creating a corporate culture of innovation will be published in January 2014 by Times Books. Today, Adam will share insights and career advice distilled from interviews with more than 200 CEOs. And with that, please help me welcome Adam Bryant.
Thanks very much, Kathleen. I appreciate all of you coming here in New York, and hi to everybody who is joining us online. Kathleen gave you a quick backstory of how I started Corner Office. And I didn't go into the project expecting to write a book. There's plenty of leadership books out there already. But I just found over the course of dozens and dozens of interviews, I started hearing a lot of patterns and certain themes started echoing. So I really just sat down to try and answer, what is it about these people that explains why they got to the Corner Office? To be clear, I'm not the first person to interview CEOs and ask them, what are the keys to your success? But what I've found, I've read a lot of other books about this, and what I found over time is that if you simply sit down with people and say, what are the secret to your success, you tend to get a lot of one-word answers like integrity and vision, and I frankly don't think that's very helpful. This was really driven home to me. I saw something online from a fairly prominent CEO who offered his 10 rules for success. And I will share a few of his insights with you now. One of them is have a good work ethic, make a plan, look for big things, don't be afraid to make a decision, embrace change, don't cheat, have a good breakfast. Okay, that last one is a joke, but I just wanted to, I throw that in to underscore the point that a lot of these things are kind of self-evident. I mean, do you really need somebody to tell you don't cheat as a key to your success? So what I, again, tried to do was figure out what is it about these people that explains why they got promoted all the way to the Corner Office. The way I framed the book is to create this sort of 100-person conceit. Imagine 100 people at a large corporation. All of them have some of these qualities that we've already described. I call them table stakes qualities. They're good communicators, they have a good work ethic, they don't cheat. Once you establish that, then what determines from that group of 100 people who will get promoted to the next level, and from that group to the next level all the way up. So I really identified 5 qualities. I don't pretend that I've cracked some secret code. I'm sure if all of you were to read the million words from the transcripts that I did, that you might come up with your own 5, but these are the 5 that I identified. I'll run through them very quickly. So the first one is passionate curiosity, and it's really just a deep sense of engagement with the world, sort of a questioning mind, interested in people, their stories, how things work, how they can be made to work better. This quality was described in a different way. I interviewed Jeff Weiner, the CEO of LinkedIn, and he told me about a word that he heard. It's called neoteny. I don't know if any of you have heard about this, but apparently it comes from the animal kingdom, and it refers to a delayed adolescence among animals. Now, if you're an animal, that's not a good thing. But if what it refers to is just sort of keeping that kind of beginner state of mind, that sort of young adolescent curiosity, how does this thing work? How can you hold on to that? I really like that phrase, passionate curiosity, because I think it's greater than the sum of its parts. We've all met people who are passionate but not necessarily curious, people who are curious but not necessarily passionate. The second quality is battle-hardened confidence, which really refers to developing a track record of being able to face down adversity. You know what you're capable of. When you're put on the hot seat, you have a sense of, I'm going to get through this. I'm not sure how I'm going to do it, but I've been in this kind of hot seat before. And this is why CEOs tell me that it's so hard to hire, because somebody might look great on paper, their resume, they've got good work experience. But at some point, that person has to get put in a stressful situation, and that's where you find out what people are really made of. Do they fold? The third quality I called a simple mindset, which refers to the ability to take really complicated things and distill them down to just the 1, 2, or 3 things that really matter. It used to be decades ago, just having the raw information was a competitive advantage, but now because of the internet, everybody's got the same information. So the real skill is, how do you distill that down? How do you synthesize it? We can have debates through dinner time about whether or not CEOs are overpaid, but I do think CEOs really earn their paycheck when you can take a big multinational corporation and say, okay, these are our 3 goals for the year. I am reminded often of the importance of just keeping things simple, because when I interview the CEOs, we might be talking about the values of their corporation. And what I find is that if I will often say to them, oh, what are they? What are your values? What I've generally found is that if they tell me they have 6 or more values, that a very predictable thing happens during the interview. Their hand comes up like this, and they start going like this. And they will shoot a look to the public relations person that's in the conference room that basically says, if I forget one, remind me. And what I've even found is I had one CEO who had to check their iPhone to remember what all their values were. And which is an important point, because if the CEO can't remember what all their values are, then how do they expect everybody else to? So I really think 3 is a magic number. I think people can remember 3 things. If you have to rush to the grocery store on a Sunday morning, you know, if milk, eggs, juice, you remember that. If add a few more things, you're going to be reaching for a little list. So a simple mindset is a really key skill. The 4th one is what I call team smarts, which is sort of the organizational equivalent of street smarts. And we all know what that means. Essentially, you have an understanding of how the organization works, how to get things done, where the sort of secret levers of power are. I also think it really refers to their good antenna for meeting dynamics and team dynamics. The way more and more work is getting done in organizations is there's a lot of ad hoc teams brought together, so you have to really know how to get people to work together. The last quality is fearlessness, which is essentially a bias towards action. When CEOs talk about this quality with me, there's a true reverence in their voice for people on their staffs who just want to do things. They might need to break a few eggs to make things better, but there's that sense of, you know, rather waiting to be told what to do, to identifying problems, even if they haven't been asked to solve the problem, but to see problems and do things and take action. A lot of the times in my interviews, I have these very serendipitous moments where CEOs will talk and kind of reference these things, these qualities in their own words. I interviewed a guy named Mark Templeton, who's the CEO of Citrix, and I asked him what he looks for when he hires people, and he told me 2 things. I'd just like to read you the very short quotes from him. He said, the first thing, he says, I value start with curiosity, because curiosity is a measure of self-motivation. People who are curious will develop themselves, they'll discover things, they'll invent things. You look for demonstrations of curiosity because that is where someone has done something on their own time that's outside the band of what they would normally be doing. Passionate curiosity. The second thing he said he looks for is scars. You can call it wisdom, he said, you can call it experience, or the things that went wrong in your life. That's where I think knowledge turns into wisdom. A lot of people will have facts and information. I'm looking for wisdom, the things that went wrong and what you did about them, and how they shaped you as a person and your beliefs. So those are really the 5 qualities. I want to put in one plug about general career advice. This comes up in a lot of the interviews with CEOs. Whenever I bring up the topic of email at work, the mood shifts in my interviews. The CEOs start getting agitated. It is a huge problem in organizations, and what I've heard from a lot of the leaders I've interviewed is that they really want to get people off email as much as they can. Email is terrific in terms of simple transactional stuff, but what I've heard from the CEOs and what I've found in my own career is that email does nothing to build the connective tissue between people and organizations. It doesn't build relationships, and it can very likely damage what little connective tissue is there because it is so easy to misread the intent of somebody's email. And it happens all the time. I'm sure it's happened to all of you at some point. You get an email and just think, what is going on here? You almost feel like an archaeologist sort of dusting away the email, looking for clues, like, what does this person mean? I've been married 26 years. I'll get an email from my wife and it's like, what's with this? Girlfriend. And this was really captured in a great interview I did with a guy named Steve Stout. This is what he tells his staff. He says, we have to get off email and pick up the phone and walk down the hall because tone makes a gigantic difference in the way somebody receives information. It defines urgency. It defines intent. You need tone and mannerisms to build relationships. Simple conversations around tasks get lost in translation if you're not speaking to the person. And to me, that's the most memorable phrase, that things get lost in translation in email. So I want to shift to hiring because I've interviewed more than 200 CEOs, and I would have to say the single biggest surprise that I've had from these interviews is when I ask them, how do you hire? What questions do you ask? I am still, to this day, hearing things that I've never heard before from the CEOs in terms of what they ask job candidates. And what I've really come to appreciate is that a lot of these leaders are like master psychologists. And it may be out of necessity because the people that they're interviewing for jobs are probably spent so many times being coached and trained to know the right answers. What are the right answers to the question? What do they want to hear? To the point where one CEO told me that it just starts sounding like music after a while. So their goal is to get people off their scripts, to ask questions. I call them sort of bank shot questions to sort of figure out what people are really like. Because we can just think of the most standard question in job interviews. You've all heard this before. You've probably been asked it. What are your strengths and weaknesses? And the whole weaknesses thing. We all know what the right answer is, right? I work too hard. I care too much. I'm a perfectionist. They've heard it all before. As just one example, I talked to a CEO of a company called Conductor, and he frames this question in a different way, and I think it's really insightful. He says, I ask people where they want to be in the future. They tell me, and then I say, do you think you're going to be different then than you are today? And they'll usually say, of course I'm going to be different. And then I'll say, so how are you going to grow from the person you are today to the person you are then? Where do you most need to grow to achieve that? That's a wonderful question because it also does away with the problem with this weakness question, which that can be taken as an affliction. Well, my weakness is this, and there's absolutely nothing I can do about it. It's sort of like having a bum leg, You're supposed to confess that. Whereas this is more just, it gets at self-awareness, which is how am I going to improve? What am I aware of that I need to work on in the future? Some of the other questions that I've heard from the CEOs, they're just disarming, and some of them are surprising. I mean, think of how all of you would answer these questions if you were asked them in a job interview, like, when are you most beautiful? And this is not a gender-specific question. It's just, when are you at your very best? When are you shining? When are you on fire? When do you feel like you really let yourself down? And what did you learn from it? CEOs often ask about failures, but I heard this interesting twist where they say, what about failures? What about a time when you failed when you were part of a team? And what was your role on the team? I love this next question. What do you view as your natural strength? What do you do that comes without any effort, that your peers struggle with and can't even match? What is natural for you? Or I sort of call this the superhero question. What is your superhero strength? Another way you can frame it is if somebody asked you, what are you in the top 5% in the world at? Very revealing. Some CEOs just ask people, what's your story? It's the ultimate open-ended question. Is that a 3-minute answer? How you answer that often tells them a lot. If you just start working through the chronology of your life, answering that tells me you're more of a checklist kind of person. If you tell them what's important to you in life, that's a different kind of answer. One CEO asked, what's the meaning of life? Not the kind of thing you think about every day. Might take you 30 seconds to figure out how to answer that. I heard this one just the other week. CEO says he asked people, what would be, if you had to pick one word to describe yourself, just one word, what would it be? Again, this is one I just heard this last week. This was very revealing. It's from a woman who's a tech CEO in Silicon Valley. She says, she asked people, what am I going to find out about you over the next 6 months that I don't know now? She says she wants people to clean out their closet in the job interview. And the other interesting thing is that she doesn't put any good or bad on it. So that leaves it up to the person to say, well, you know, if my sandwich is not in the fridge, I freak out. Or you will find that, you know, when the pressure is really on, that I do really well in those circumstances. The point is that you should be really honest and you should be yourself in these interviews. And it really does come down to self-awareness, just having that sense of who you are, what's important to you. And I think the interesting thing about a lot of these questions is that even if you were to never be asked these questions in a job interview, just thinking about them and how you would answer that, I think that gives that people that sort of X factor, just that you're comfortable in your own skin, that you're kind of secure in yourself. So many interesting questions. One woman I interviewed, actually, I do a lot of role playing in my interviews, and I say, how would you interview me? And she started grilling me. She said, why do you work? Like, okay, well, I got a mortgage to pay and college tuition. Then I was like, no, why? And she just kept pressing me, why do you work? And she said, what do you want and why do you want it? And it's one of those things, again, you just, if somebody keeps coming at you with that question, you start getting through the layers of it. I mentioned Steve Stout earlier. He addressed this point, and I think it's really speaks to the heart of this notion of self-awareness. He says, I'm looking to hire people who are honest with themselves. If you're honest with yourself, we could work together. We can adjust on the go, we can call an audible at the line of scrimmage because you're honest with yourself. But if you're not honest with yourself, you're always trying to not let me find out something, or you're trying to not let yourself find out something. You don't want to find out from somebody else something about yourself that you don't already know. He says, I think that's a very important attribute of successful people. They are honest with themselves. If you're not honest with yourself, then you don't know what you don't know. To me, the most memorable part of that is don't let anybody tell you something about yourself that you don't already know. I think that's a really great way to crystallize what self-awareness is, because you hear that so much in discussions about job interviews. A couple of final questions I want to share before we go to questions. I interviewed Tony Hsieh, the head of Zappos, and he asked a couple of surprising questions. Think about how you would answer this. He said to me, what is the biggest misperception that people have about you? How would you answer that? Turns out that's just the setup. The punchline after you answer that is, what's the difference between perception and misperception? So his basic point is perception is reality. So you might answer that by saying, well, a lot of people think I'm a total jerk, but I'm not. Well, perception is reality. And again, sort of an interesting bank shot to get at the notion of self-awareness. The other thing he says he asks people is, and again, how would you answer this? On a scale of 1 to 10, how weird are you? And I love this question for a lot of reasons. I think it works on several levels. One is that it signals to job candidates that it acknowledges that everybody's weird to some degree, right? We're all weird. And I actually think there's a sort of trick in the algorithm of that question, that the lower you answer on the scale of weirdness, the weirder you actually are. So I think that's one of the reasons it works. It also signals to job candidates that Zappos wants some of your weirdness. I mean, if you ever go in the YouTube videos of some of Zappos culture, they have a lot of fun down there, and it's kind of a signal that we want all of you here. We don't want you to check part of yourself at the door. And it's also just a good screen. I mean, if you ask somebody on a scale of 1 to 10, how weird are you, and the person answers 12, you might want to sort of pause and ask, well, why is that a little bit? So anyways, again, this has been some of the highlights from the interviews, and I just think they're great to wrestle with. Even if nobody ever asks you how weird you are in an interview, it's good to know how you'd answer that. So with that, I'd love to hear some questions, both online and here in the audience.
Question from the audience, Adam. From the online audience, what was your original motivation for the corner office column, and how is that different from what it has become today, especially regarding how being featured in the column is now seen as a type of accomplishment for a CEO?
Yeah, the very quick backstory on why I started it. I was a business reporter at the Times for many years, interviewed a lot of CEOs, and what dawned on me over time is that CEOs are pretty much always interviewed in the business press as strategists. The basic architecture of the interview is, what is your plan and what is the competitive landscape? I just found myself being more interested in them as people, and I just wanted to ask them, how do you do what you do? I became a manager myself about a dozen years ago and found out how hard it is to manage people. So I wanted to ask them, how did you learn to do what you do? Because I do think people have this notion of CEOs that they're born leaders. From the time they were in diapers, they knew exactly how to lead people. And I thought there must be some way to get at that learning curve. So that led to very simple what if. What if I sat down with CEOs and literally never asked them any of the usual questions about their companies, their products, their strategy. And we just talked about, leadership lessons, culture, how do you hire. So that was the backstory in terms of why I started. I have to say it's exceeded all my expectations in terms of the following it's garnered. It's been incredibly gratifying. It's gotten to the point now where I often feel like kind of the bouncer at the velvet rope in a club, and there's a very long line of people who want to get in. That's great for a number of reasons, because I like it when people want to talk to me about leadership, that they want to have this conversation, and it also lets me be incredibly choosy. So that by the time I agree to interview somebody, I've usually done a lot of work up front to make sure that they're candid, open, honest, they've got surprising and insightful ideas about leadership. Again, I get pitched all day long over the phone and over email. Most people don't know how to pitch me. I will scan the emails I get very quickly, and I'm looking for something, just something a little surprising, some nugget. Like the email I got about a woman named Nikki Leondakis, who's the Chief Operating Officer of Kimpton Hotels, and there's a little detail in the email that says she makes new managers at an annual company event every year, participate in a hula hoop competition. And I thought, I have not heard that before. I think I'd like to follow up with that. So I wrote back to the company and said, please send me more. And that hula hoop thing is a great thing because they use it almost as a gatekeeping system, because if you're not able to laugh at yourself, and everybody looks silly doing hula hoop, especially on a stage in front of your new colleagues. So if you're not going to feel comfortable doing that, they probably don't want you working there. So it's really those kind of details that I'm looking for. Just some different approach. I'm starting to get emails from companies where they've done away with titles. I'm seeing this sort of new pattern. We just do away, even this Wall Street firm. And that intrigues me because, that's probably a bit of a disruption, because a lot of people, their business card is really important to them. So.
Any from the audience here?
First of all, thanks for your insights. That's very interesting. I was wondering if you had a lot of CEOs who came from different cultures, and if you noticed any differences to the American CEOs.
I try to, in my interviews, embrace diversity in literally every sense of the word, from small to medium to large companies, gender, from countries. I think that if I had to make a generalization, I think sometimes with CEOs in other countries, they're not necessarily as inclined to be as open and honest, as candid as some of the American CEOs. I mean, I talked to a Japanese CEO, and he talked about this. He said when he came to work in the United States, he really had to work on this because he said the employees he managed wanted to know more about him and wanted him to be more open, and that wasn't a natural fit for him, but he understood that it was, if he wanted to be an effective leader, he had to do that. So I think one of the transitions we're moving into as a country, and you really see this in Silicon Valley more than anywhere else, because in Silicon Valley, culture is such an important part of holding on to employees. I mean, if there's such a battle for talent in the tech field, that it's one thing to attract a talented software engineer, it's a whole other challenge to hold on to them because they're getting recruited every single day. So what I've found is that the tech CEOs have to really think long and hard about culture and work on developing a place that people feel like they're growing, they're rewarded, their voice matters, and that they want to stay. And in Silicon Valley, I mean, there's just so many nationalities are there. It's such an amazing melting pot. And so in some ways, a lot of the distinctions kind of blur out there.
Hi, I'm Ivana Vianney from Fairleigh Dickinson University, and in the last few months I went through an interview process for medical schools, and I'm happy to report that they ask most of the questions that you said, so
Oh,
I'm
really?
very...
Okay. So how weird are you? No.
That one wasn't asked yet. One of the things that came up in my interviews that I saw, and I was surprised at, was that a lot of times other interests that I had were seen almost as a negative thing. Really? And so my question was, do you see that in today's culture, because everything is getting so specialized, do you see that maybe the CEOs are valuing more specialization versus having differing interests in different areas?
I would actually say I'm hearing the opposite, that people, the CEOs very often ask, you know, what do you like to do outside of work? And for a couple of reasons. One is that they sort of see it as an indication of how passionate you are as a person. Do you have other interests? One CEO told me that that's essentially the time away from work, when you're not sleeping or at work, what you do there can really set you apart in terms of doing new things, building your skill set and the like. It was really captured in a great phrase, and going back to this guy Steve Stout that I mentioned, what he talks about in his company is that he wants everybody to have a major and a minor, so that they come to their company and it's like, this may be their specialized skill, but he runs an advertising firm. And maybe you work you're an account supervisor, but you have a hobby in photography. And he says, I want you to bring that to work. And when we're talking about how something looks, we want you in that meeting. So I just feel, what I'm hearing from the CEOs is they want all of you at work. Not when you walk in the door, like, do you subconsciously check your hobbies at the door and your interests and your passion? They want all of it now, because they recognize that if you bring your best self to work and all of your best self, that's going to lift the company.
Any other questions? So thank you. I think that's all we have time for.
Great.
Thank you so much, Adam.
Thank you. Thank you.